Grief is a journey, but it's a very important journey to make. Matter of fact, I often say that grief is one of the major social problems of our time, and that sounds like a very weird statement to make because we don't see grief as a social problem. We see grief as that period of sadness that happens after someone dies. I say it's a social problem because we have no idea how many of the things we call social problems had their beginning in grief or trauma that were not properly dealt with and were allowed to sit there and fester until they ultimately exemplified themselves in some of the things we call social problems. We have no idea how much divorce comes out of grieving, and we have no way of proving how much divorce comes out of grieving. Several years ago, someone tried to determine that whether or not the divorce rate was higher among people who'd lost a child. And in my experience, it is, but there's no way to prove it because the divorce doesn't happen then, it happens later. It's like a lady said, I'm surprised that divorce comes out of this experience, but she said it happened to me, it just took 30 years. She said 30 years later we divorced, but really our marriage broke the night my son died, and we discovered that we didn't know how to visit with each other or communicate, and we didn't know how to help each other. And you know, it's hard to lean on someone that's already been double in their own grief, and wedges were driven into the relationship that down the road exemplified themselves in divorce. We have no idea how much substance abuse comes out of this experience of grief that's not properly dealt with. I've walked with a lady whose daughter was murdered. And her daughter was murdered because she was at the wrong place buying drugs. And everyone was so astounded that such a lovely, beautiful girl and such a talented girl would have that kind of problem. But what everybody missed in the equation, and even all the counselors that they went to, and they did go to an awful lot of them, what they all missed was that when that little girl was 9 years of age, her father died in a plane crash. And after that, the mother walked in one day and the daughter was crying, and they had a very hysterical time. And when they finally got over the hysteria, the mother said, "What can I do to help you?" And the little girl said, "If you just wouldn't cry anymore." And they made a pledge that night to never cry together again, and they never did. Now, when a 9-year-old little girl starts trying to have that much control of her life, then you're creating all kinds of aftermath problems, which led, and it did in her case, it led first of all to anorexia, which is certainly an effort to be in total control, and anorexia led to alcohol. Alcohol led to other substance abuse led to being at the wrong place at the wrong time, buying drugs, and she died. But we never make those connections. There's a great book out by Lenore Terr called Too Scared to Cry, and it's the story of Chowchilla, California, where several years ago some people captured a school bus and buried the kids alive. They had a 18-wheeler trailer buried back in the earth, and they put the kids through an opening in the top, and the kids could hear them putting dirt on top of the opening. There was one 13-year-old child in there that had an awful lot of moxie, and he made them hold him up, and he basically dug them out. 34 hours they were home, not a scratch on them, so no problem. Everything back to normal. Nobody did anything about it. Lenore Terr did a study of those children 6 years later and found out there was a tremendous rise in substance abuse, a tremendous rise in early pregnancy or pregnancy outside of marriage, a tremendous rise in early marriage, all of which she related back to that experience. The 13-year-old kid that dug them out is now on the rodeo circuit, but he's there after having a tremendous struggle with substance abuse. So when we start talking about our grief, this is not something we can bury. It is not something we can just let time heal. This is a journey that we need to take very seriously and walk to as best we can through every aspect of the grieving experience. I guess it helps to stop and define it. My definition of grief is that grief is the natural response to any loss. And there are two key words in that definition. One of them is any. Any loss produces grieving. If you lose your billfold, you're going to go through some grief. Now, it's not the same grief as going through the loss of someone, but it's a grieving experience. You know, you'll even tell yourself you didn't lose it, you left it at home on the dresser. You know, you have those feelings all day, and then you go home and you find that it isn't there. And gradually a hollow feeling comes in the middle of your stomach. That's grief. You know, that's what happens to our bodies when loss happens. The second part of the definition or key word is natural or normal, or that there is built in us a natural process for grieving, and that we need to allow that process to happen, to not try to go around it, to not try to explain it away, but to experience it. I got involved in grief quite by accident. I was a pastor of a church, and one of my members had a child get the croup one day, and as the child got worse all day, they went to the doctor. The doctor put the child in the hospital, put it under oxygen tent, sent the husband home to take care of the other child in the home because there was no real immediate danger, and that child died in 30 minutes. And of course the mother was hysterical, and the doctor was trying to calm her down, and her husband was trying to calm her down, and she stopped and looked at them and said, "Don't take my grief away from me. I deserve it, and I'm going to have it." I always felt like that was one of the more profound statements I'd ever heard under pressure, but also was glad I wasn't there. Because had I been there, that's exactly what I would have been trying to do. That's how I saw my job. My job was to cheer everybody up. My job was to make them stop crying. My job was to do whatever I could do to get them through the funeral without shedding any tears. And so I would do anything, really, trying to get them happy. I thought, boy, if I could just make them happy, and never realized that what I really was doing was short-circuiting the natural pattern that leads to healing. You see, I think grief is nature's way of healing a broken heart, and I wasn't allowing people to have that. Everyone that goes through grief almost experiences somebody trying to take it away from us, trying to explain it away, trying to put the best face on it, trying to tell us that we should be over it. And out of that experience, I realized that I could no longer do that. And so I started getting people together that had just gone through grief. And I guess accidentally started some of the first grief groups, because I'd never heard of groups at the time. But out of that experience, I began to learn some things about grief. One of the things I learned was how long grief lasts. Most people will give you about 3 months and then they think it should be over. I think grief lasts a minimum of 2 years. And when I say that, I want you to know you're not going to hurt like you hurt right now for 2 years. But I think it takes that long to get through all of the emotional upheaval that happens in our lives when someone that we love deeply dies. It's sort of like taking chemotherapy. You take chemotherapy for 6 or 8 weeks, and it's very intense and it's very tough, and then it's over, and everybody expects it to be over, but it takes a long time to get all the chemicals out of your system, sometimes a year or so, before you actually feel back to normal. Well, that's kind of the way grief is. It's very intense, and when the intensity is over, everybody thinks, okay, you're okay. They don't realize that there's the aftermath of all that experience takes time to work through, to get our emotions back to level, to feel the way we used to feel, and to become somewhat whole again, and to live again. So grief is a journey. It's a long journey. It's a very important journey, and the ultimate goal of the journey is that you will one day not stop hurting, because the pain will always be there, but that one day you'll turn the corner in the way you cope and begin to live again.